Um, this thing's in my way again. Get rid of you for a second. So this time I'm clicking into here to find lab 3. And lab 3 is resource modules. Network automation basics, resource modules. So we'll start this one up. And this would be an alternative to what we did in lab 1, where here they called it lines, right? They called it commands, the alias in the previous, our first lab. But same thing, where we're actually needing to know the CLI syntax to add these configurations. As an alternative, we can use the resource module for SNMP servers. So we're dealing with a declarative module as opposed to an imperative line by line type of module. And we'll have to wait a few more seconds.
Question, where is that PDF? Is that available? Because I see in the chat it only has the document for lab 1.
It should be pinned all the way at the top at 147.
Yeah, I clicked on that and it only shows up to lab 1, unless I'm missing something in that.
Oh yeah, I just only have slides that set up lab 1. The rest of it, we're just going through the instructions. So it should say like, let me click in here. Like when it ends, oops, this silly Google Meets thing keeps getting in my way. So like I download it, right? What you should see is up until here. And then there should just be a reference slide after that. Is that what you're referring to?
Oh, so we weren't clicking into lab 2 like you had there, or lab 3.
Yeah, I was just clicking to get back to this part and just making sure that people click into the correct lab from there.
Oh, okay.
Because there's not like a direct link into these. It just takes you to this landing page. But there's all these other labs on here. So the 3 that we cared about was the first playbook, and then we just did the facts, and now we're on the resource modules.
Okay.
But you can do these other ones too today or at any time. They just take a few more minutes to spin up. But this would be more like the automation controller, like the GUI labs. But they'll show you like workflows and all that good stuff. So not there. This one, right? No. Yeah, this one. So if you're at this point, you can hit start. And we're starting with the terminal to get to our router. So we'll go to the router. So here they're saying do show SNMP. Before we were doing show run and include or section SNMP. So either way, it's fine. Just make sure that there's no config for SNMP. Right, no agent enabled. Oh, he did the same thing, but in the opposite order. Okay. All right, so that's just the first step, is just to verify that. Not quite right. What you talking about? Maybe if I exit out. No, that's weird. You got to exit out of the router or you can't go to the next step. Configuration to code. So here's where we start talking about the resource modules. To me, they're very powerful because I do a lot of multi-vendor, and because of the requirements of what a resource module should include and how they develop them, they're really similar. So even if you're looking at Palo Alto firewalls versus a Cisco router, there's a lot of synergy between them. So really, the whole notion of resource modules adds for consistency. Even though they might, you're doing different things, a router is different than a firewall or whatever, but like the way that you're interacting with it is very similar in terms of using the resource modules. So here we're going to use SNMP just to show like what it would have looked like in Lab 1 of using resource modules instead of the just basic generic config module. I'm going to go ahead and give myself a terminal down here at the bottom. And then this is to get to the router, this terminal. And then the first part of this is we're going to create a playbook, and we're going to call it resource.yaml. And this was giving me fits earlier trying to make my new file. All right, I guess I'll do the same thing I did before, is I'll just save it as the name. All right, so there's the first part of the playbook, and then file, save as. Resource.yaml. All right. Make sure I got everything that they have. All right, so this module here, it's the vendor is Cisco. It's the ILS collection, or also known as ILS XE. And then the module is SNMP_server, or you could call it ILS_SNMP server. The state is merged. Now with resource modules, they have various states that we'll talk about here a little bit further down in the lab guide, but the default state is merged. So you really don't have to explicitly call it out in the module, but I think they're doing it here just so that you can become more familiar with what the different states do. But merged is the one that is idempotent in the sense that you can only add things that aren't there. You're not going to remove anything that shouldn't be there. That would be replaced, is that state. And there's also overridden, where what you'll do is you'll wholesale delete the entire configuration and completely overwrite it with your new configuration. Now, how and why and when to use one over the other depends on what you're configuring. So a lot of times when we get into access lists and VLANs and things like that, it's not a good idea to do the overridden, especially if it's going to remove like the ability for connectivity to work. So like just keep that in mind for certain things where you want to merge certain configs in and maybe replace or remove just very specific parts of the config, as opposed to just deleting, overwriting the entire config. So here they're going to examine, like this is kind of like a refresh. This is the play. You can have more than one play in a playbook, but typically I wouldn't recommend that unless you really, there's a reason for that. In your playbook, you can have, the multiple plays would just be like I could start again under here at this level and then call another group from host, then that play could have different variables and things like that. But normally we just have a playbook that's very simple. And for the more complicated things, we're going to call a role that we talked about in the slides. But in this case here, we have the play and we have the task. And right here, we have one task, and then we can add to that. We're not gathering the facts, generic default facts here. We're not using that, so it's good to turn that off so it doesn't take up space in memory and add to the amount of time it takes to run the playbook. Now, here's where they start talking about the different states that we can change. So we talked about merge, just the default. Replaced, and how this would work is here you can see that we're statically entering these configs into the playbook. Normally, we're going to have variables here. So we're going to read in a configuration file of sorts. But since this is like a 101 level viewpoint of this, we're not asking you to create variable files. So we're keeping it simple with, okay, under the config parameter, we're defining all these parameters actually in the task itself. But if we had saved them somewhere else, Ansible can find them, and then we could iterate through them into this task. And then we would apply them differently depending on the state, what state we set for that module. So if we had changed it to replaced, what would happen is when Ansible connects to that device, it's going to look at its running config, and it's going to see what its existing configuration is and compare it to this configuration that it's trying to merge. Now, if it notices that this stuff's already there, then it will ignore it. It's not going to merge it into there. If we had select replaced, if we had a configuration on the running config that does not represent this configuration, we would look at replacing the items that don't exist in our config. So in this case, if there was some other, SNMP entry that's on the device that's not in our config, we would actually replace, like remove that entry and then just add the things that are in our configuration. If it was overridden, then we really don't care what the existing running config is. We're just going to delete it, and then it's going to be overridden with this config. Delete it will delete whatever's in our config. So if we made a mistake, we could run this playbook again and change the state to delete it. It's only going to delete our config, not anything else aside from this. So that would be like a scoped rollback. Now, rendered and parsed kind of go together. They just do opposite things. So when we run through this configuration, we're rendering a command line configuration that's sent to the device. So in rendered, if you run this playbook in rendered, it's just going to tell us the command lines that it would send that represent what this YAML config is. It'll just show you the equivalent in command lines. Parsed is the opposite. You can run parsed against the command line config, like a backup config. And parse is typically used like offline. So we have like our backups, and we'll read them in, and they're all like command lines. And it'll tell us, make that conversion to what it looks like in structured data. So we'll convert it to like a YAML config like this for us. Gathered, all it does is it looks at the configuration on the running device. So this one's not offline, it's the running device, and it'll pull that config in, and it'll show us what it looks like in structured data like this. So that's a good one, like to see what the existing config is for like compliance checks and things like that. But if we need to go a step further and we need to convert that into command line, then we can do the parsed. Or I'm sorry, the rendered. The rendered goes from the structure to the command line. And then the documentation explains these and how to use them. But it's very powerful because if you're having a hard time understanding what that payload should look like as structured data, or what it would have looked like as the command line, then you can easily run the playbook offline, and it'll just show you exactly what it looks like. There's built-in diffs in resource modules where it shows you the before and after in structured data config. And if you're running it in check mode, then the before and after look the same because you don't actually make the change. But in run mode, your before and after are always different. And it'll also show you the command lines. So it shows you the like the equivalent of the command lines that were rendered. And that's all built into the modules, which when you start working with them, you'll see they're very easy to understand. Once you look at them, it's a little bit easier to wrap your head around it. And they make it a lot easier for you to get started in automation as well, without needing to know like every command line that you're trying to push into the device. So from that, what we want to do is we have this playbook. Make sure you save the playbook. And what else we have down here? If you don't already, please save the playbook, and then we can go into the next challenge. I did save mine, but just double check. I'll do a file save. And we go on to this next step. We're going to run our playbook in Navigator. We already learned all this stuff previously about the TUI and running it with standard output mode and all that good stuff. All right, so here's our playbook as it were. And they want us to run this playbook in standard output mode. So I can just copy that and paste. And this should give us changed because these communities are new. Right, so we have the one change. And I think they want us to run it one more time just to show the idempotent part of it again. We'll just get an okay this time. And then verify your SNMP configuration. I need to do that from this terminal. SSH Cisco. Show SNMP. All right, so now we have an SNMP configuration from the show command, and I can also see it in the running config. Here. Complete. And what else are we going to do? All right, so now we're going to retrieve some facts again. But this is more from like the resource module level of facts. So we want to create a new playbook. This time I'm just going to do it from down here with touch. Then we're going to call this gathered.yaml. So that'll create it up here, right? Right there it is. I'm clicking there and there's nothing in there. And I don't like to type, so I'm going to just paste this in. So this time, we're using that same module, SNMP_server, but the state is not merged, the state is gathered. So we're going to gather our SNMP config, the one that we just pushed into that device. And then what we're going to do is the contents of what we gather, right? So it's going to give us the structured data, a config that, looks like a YAML config is going to come in. And then we're going to register it into memory. So the contents of that gathered configuration is becoming a variable called SNMP_config. And then what we can do is we can use the copy module, which if we use the fully qualified name, it would be ansible.builtin.copy. And the copy module has an src parameter, like if we want to point to a source file, or we can point to content. So we're pointing to the content of what we've registered in memory here, the SNMP config, right? And it's named SNMP config. This pipe is indicative of a filter. And the filter that we're using is called toNiceYAML, because by default, the content that we saw on the screen when we run the playbook is just a blob of JSON. We want to turn that blob of JSON into nice YAML, which is very human readable in YAML format. And then the destination is going into these variable placeholders. So playbook directory is where we're running our playbooks. So that's this directory over here. And then we're going to create, based off of the inventory host name, which was the Cisco down here that we're running it against. It's going to take that and prepend it to here to _snmp.yaml file. So we'll have a Cisco _snmp.yaml file that represents the configuration of SNMP that we just built in the previous lab. So this is how you can gather configs from a device and create config files that you save into your project that you're working on with your playbooks. So this stuff may seem a little foreign right now, but just think of it as these variable placeholders. These are magic variables. So playbook directory works the same, regardless what type of playbooks you're running against. It's always just going to go right to that directory, that parent directory where you're running your playbooks from in Navigator. And from there, inventory host name is always going to look into the inventory. And it's a host name under the group that you're running in your playbook. So under Cisco, the group Cisco. And then the host, Cisco underneath, would be the one that we're actually running, when we run that playbook. So hopefully that makes sense. So what we want to do now is just make sure that I have that saved. And this talks about what I just said, like we did merge the first time. This is gathered. And then we're going to ultimately save in our home directory on this lab pod, Cisco_snmp.yaml file. And then for the playbook, we're going to run it in standard output mode. And we should see a file show up in here. Right, so the actual path is home rel, right? And we're in rel. And then let's refresh this. See how I refreshed it and it popped out right here. And then that represents our configuration that we read in from the device and structured data. But then this could be used as a configuration file to move forward, automating that device. This can become the single source of truth, for not the entire config, because we're only looking at the SNMP config, but then we could build out, multiple of these. And normally you would save them in host vars and then have, one available for each type of config that would map to a resource module, for that type of config, like OSPF or BGP or VLANs or, any of those. And I think that may be the end of this one. Yes.